I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas-Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, and welcome to Arcane Mark. Tabletop Fabula
Ultima Edition.
So, on Table Talk, we're going to talk about some tabletop RPG that we've played and that we like, because I don't really want to talk about tabletop RPGs that I didn't like. We could potentially critique them. There's room to critique and to find points of improvement, but I'd rather focus on the positive.
Especially because, we haven't spent that much time engaging with the ones we don't like, because, if we try something we don't like it, then we're probably just going to bounce off of it. So, Fabula Ultima has not been out for particularly long. It is a new indie RPG that is based off of very much the video game JRPG, Japanese-style RPG tropes.
In fact, the cover says Fabula Ultima TTJ RPG.
Yes.
To make that clear.
So, basically, it's not literally just what if you love Final Fantasy and you want it at your table, but it's also not literally just that. Because it has
both of the things you said were the same. You mean that it's not
literally just that. Yes, you're right. It's very similar. It has, there's a lot of other JRPGs that it draws inspiration from, but I guess also, the game that we played in it was, more based on the Final Fantasy type tropes. But
they're directly in the rulebook, so...
yeah.
When you look at the way that Fabula Ultima is laid out as an RPG, there are several basic sections. The introduction...
Which talks
first,
about,
then the game rules, then there's something called Press Start, which is the quick start guide, followed by the Game Master section and the Bestiary.
Yeah. So in the introduction, it has the kinds of things that you would expect in any RPG book that's like, what is a Game Master? What is role-playing? This is a game.
Some RPG books nowadays have decided they're not going to actually answer that question, surprisingly, Linda. I've seen some that are just if you don't know what that is already, go look somewhere else or Google it. Or go on YouTube and look up an actual play or something like that, which are not helpful answers. So it's good, even though most of your people, if you're an indie RPG, probably have played another RPG before, it's good to include some kind of answer.
Yeah, it's good to cover the basics, and this totally does.
Plus, by knowing what you say to that definition, it tells you a lot about what the RPG is going to be like. An introduction is often skipped by many people who are reading the book for a tabletop RPG who will jump right into the rules or the classes or somewhere else. But I believe that introductions can help you understand the philosophy of the game's designer, as well as figuring out what this game is good for and what the game is about.
And one of the things that you also find as early as this introduction is that this game takes inspiration not just from Japanese video game RPGs, but also from Japanese tabletop RPGs and the ways that those are some of the conventions that are more common in Japanese tabletop games than in American ones, which was really cool to engage with as we were going through this as well.
Connections and contacts with NPCs are more formalized in some Japanese RPGs, for example, for tabletop RPGs.
And one other thing that it tells you up here is that it is a game for a GM and 2 to 5 players.
Right. And depending on what you're doing with those players, you could, for instance, have 2 players that are playing multiple characters. You could have 2 players that are each only playing one character. The scaling we can get into a little bit later on, because we have actually done it with 2 players and 3 to 5 characters, so we've seen the scaling at different points.
When it comes to one of the next things that the book does is it gets into the setting, and instead of having a single unified default setting for Fabula Ultima has what are called the 8 pillars that are the fundamental assumptions of your world, and then it has some broad world tropes that it recommends that you might consider trying.
Right.
So
the 8 pillars talk about things like magic and technology, or the fact that it's all about the heroes. They give you the 8 major philosophical points of the TTRPG. Then the different subgenres that are in there mention a few that have their own separate source books for them. like high fantasy and natural fantasy and techno fantasy, but the default setting is a blend in between that has like some magic tech, and there's both magic and technology in a certain degree. Whereas those other subgenres that get a 2-page spread in the book and then they have their own separate supplemental source books that we do not have.
Yeah, but I also do want to go back to the 8 pillars a little bit because they speak to some of the fundamental underlying assumptions of how to structure your game, like saying it's all about the heroes, that this is going to be, you know, a big scale game with dramatic plot twists that very much centers on what the PCs are doing, that there's mystery and discovery, that, you know, like in a lot of these sorts of games, you can be like a tiny child wielding a gigantic sword, and it's about the rule of cool a lot more than the realism on that. It's a dangerous world that with lots of ancient ruins to be discovered and harsh lands, and everything in the world has a soul and spiritual energy.
That's right. So those pillars are something that's generally assumed to always be true about the setting, but other than that, the setting is not defined. In fact, one of the things that is maybe not obvious going through the introduction, but that you will find out later, or at least I, as the GM who was like quickly reading through this and then trying to figure out how to set up a session, discovered is that you will find out later on, possibly after you've already started daydreaming or brainstorming things that you've been inspired to from the introduction, that session 0 is intended to have the players come up with a whole bunch of stuff on their own that may or may not put a monkey wrench into anything that you thought of before you got to chapter 3. So that's one thing that I would say to keep in mind if you're going to run Fabula Ultima. It was the only thing I would say is a surprise due to the book's organization, and that I had to tell Linda and my brother, who we were playing it with, like, oh wait, hold on, I got to a point here that's saying that we need to do a session 0. We're not going to be able to do it today because depending on what you guys say in the session 0, I may not be able to use any of the things I've been thinking of while reading it up until this point. Now, if you are the type of person who, like I usually am, has a lot of these books and has read them all in advance well before you've ever actually played a game, then it wouldn't matter that you don't find that out until chapter 3. Also, if your group is full of players who are not as used to like brainstorming and coming up with their own setting content, you can ignore the part in chapter 3 that says that the players need to come up with the countries and other parts of the world, and either have them just kind of tell you a little bit about what they want their character to be like, and you can mix that in, or find a good place for it, or some other collaborative way. It doesn't have to be exactly one that's listed there. In fact, what we came down to was something that was close to what was listed in chapter 3, but it also involved me coming up with a higher percentage of the content than chapter 3 normally would have, where it seems that it's a round robin, or if anything, that the players may come up with almost everything and the GM doesn't come up with much.
Yeah. And, you know, that's a balance that every game has its own different balance. And like how when it talks about the game master, one of the instructions is play to find out what happens. And it very much talks about, like, you know, player decisions shaping the flow of things. So I find that sometimes games that focus on that more are more like, hey, you know, the player should be directing these kinds of things, and GM stay out of the way. So there's a little bit of that going on in here.
That's right.
But the extent to which anytime you see that in a game, you know, regardless of what the default is, your table can always choose to skew things more in one direction or another.
That's right.
So,
also, to be clear, the introduction does clearly state that the players are going to be creating the game world.
Mm-hmm.
If you take that literally to, which I did not take it literally enough when I was reading it. It does say, together with everyone else, you will give birth to a fantastical setting populated with bizarre monsters, great mysteries, and powerful magic. I was just thinking, you will do that as the player. Like, your role in it is that you're going to be the hero that's in that world, because it said it was hero focused. But it does, like, literally say that you're going to be, yeah, it does literally say that you're going to be creating it under players, and it does not say that you will be doing that under as the GM, other than that you will assist the players during world creation. And that turns out to be completely correct based on what they later mention in Chapter 3.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see the idea of playing to find out what happens, this tells you a lot about the philosophy of the game. Because some games are a little bit more sort of narratively railroaded, where the GM is coming up with a plot and sort of the players are coming along with that plot. Whereas other games are more of sandboxy and are just like, I don't know what's going to happen. The dice are going to determine what's going to happen. The plot twists are going to determine what's going to happen. And Fabula Ultima manages to be, at least philosophically, more toward the sandboxiness, even though JRPGs do tend to be extremely railroady.
Yeah. Which is pretty cool. I mean, like, the way we were able to do it with being like, okay, you know, here's some branches, and then as with any sort of sandbox run, it's useful as the GM to gather a sense of what the players are planning to do next session at the end of sessions you could prep for like what direction they're heading in. So after the introduction, it gets into the game rules, which starts off with a very typical, like, you know, these rules aren't set in stone. You can change things if you want to, but like, try it out first before you start monkeying around with everything, which I think that's another thing you see in like quite a few rule books.
That's right.
And then it talks about the role of scenes in this game.
Because while it's based on JRPGs, it very much uses the idea of breaking things into narrative scenes, which include not only the typical combats or conflict scenes, which may also not be a direct combat, they could be a social conflict. They include slower down interlude scenes that are more like your time in a JRPG when you're back in town, and game master scenes, which are also more common in tabletop games in Japan, where the game master just kind of does a cutscene. Also, obviously, in video game JRPGs, where there's just a cutscene and you see what the villains are doing a little bit, even though the player characters have no idea about any of this.
As a matter of fact, these game master scenes are a hard-coded part of the game that they happen at certain times.
They are theoretically mandatory that, as far as I've come to take it, and I'm no expert in this, I read through the entire book and I've run like 4-ish sessions of it, but if I didn't read anything wrong, then every time the PCs do the rest mechanic that replenishes all their resources, all of the villains advance their plots, and they always get a villain scene, which also generates points, meta currency for the PCs, in such a way that if you have multiple villains, now there is a cap at 3 villains per point, then you're going to wind up getting a large number of that meta currency. So there may be something somewhere else in the book that tells me not to do that at that pace, but as far as I can tell, it's hard-coded that your villains will be advancing and you will be doing a scene.
That the players will see a scene of, like, you know, the villain talking to some kind of, you know, shadowy figure, you're not quite sure, or like cursing their luck that something foiled, and you get the hint of some kind of thing,
or moving onward a little bit. But
those points are a very key part of the game. So I think that it is something that you're supposed to have. Like, there's something that
I'm not sure that I'm doing it right, but it seems that I am based on what I've read. But the thing about it is, and we'll get into villains a little bit later, but there's a really cool villain escalation mechanic that if you're going to take one thing and bring it to your non-Fabula Ultima game, it might be the villain escalation mechanic. And that mechanic means that villains have a countdown timer, at which point, after every battle, or due to using their points during the battles, their countdown goes down. And at the end of the battle, they escape and their countdown goes down by 1. And when it reaches 0, they are either defeated completely and captured, or whatever you want to do, or they escalate to another phase of escalation, and they become a more major scale threat. You know, like somewhat gesture-ish comic relief villain suddenly kills the emperor, pushes the statues out of order, and becomes an evil god tower guy in the world of Ruin. To give an example of a JRPG that did that pretty well. So, because of that, it seems like most villains, if you don't manage to use all of your points before the end of the fight, will escape their first fight. Which also means that if you had another villain going on and you created like a minor side villain, at least in my case, I quickly wound up with 3 people, the maximum number that I had to track. And I feel like if you have 1 villain every time you rest, it doesn't give a lot of points. But if you have 3, it gives a lot of points. So there may be something I didn't see that says that. I did see the 3 being the limit in there. So when you're playing Fabula Ultima, you can check that out as well.
Yeah, I see some comments. I wanted to circle back to those.
Sure thing. The comments were about the fact that the players can come up with everything, but that many groups do, like having their GM come up with some of the stuff anyway, so there can still be some secrets in the world. And Mondering Main said a cut doesn't have to reveal a lot. It could just show the results of the characters not making a certain decision. The villain could be off screen. Absolutely. Generally, when I ran it, I made sure that the villain scenes, the GM scenes, were pretty mysterious while still revealing some information. The main thing was just that the meta currency that was gained in them really stacked up when the PCs rested. Now, they still didn't abuse that because of the fact that that also meant multiple villains were advancing their plot every time that they rested, and it felt like they had to rush.
Yeah, you have to deal with it. Yeah. So another thing about the scenes too is that there's a lot of effects that have a duration until the end of the current scene. So very much the game is structured into like, are you in a scene or not, and what type of scene are you doing?
That's right. So you have campaigns, which are made up of sessions, which are made up of scenes. And that's generally how the structure works.
And sessions are assumed to be about 4 hours. If you were to do a longer session, which like we did
one of the times,
then you probably want to break it into mini sessions because of the fact that there are some reward mechanics that are based off of per session.
That's right. So that after that, they start going into some of the more mechanical rules, like rounding down, specific beats general, some of the sort of general rules. And then you start looking into how characters are built in Fabula Ultima. So this is the first point that we get into character building information. Now, it's not enough to actually build your characters yet. That will only happen in the 3rd chapter. But you can also tell a lot about an RPG based on what is listed first on the character sheet. And for Fabula Ultima, that is your traits, which are your identity, like Sky Pirate, your theme, like justice or anger, and your origin, which is your homeland of where you come from.
And it does specifically call out that both your identity and theme can change during play. This game very much follows the model of like characters should evolve and change over time in between sessions. Well, those things, you're likely to see those kinds of things change eventually in response to large events. The next section here, bonds, is something that is changing very frequently.
So there's a question, is there an optimal way for players to behave? Are they rewarded for minimizing the number of villains? So, Knots, there is no way to minimize the number of villains because for the players to do so, because the villains automatically escape if they have any number of villain points. And even if the villain points get to 0, the GM can choose to have them escalate. And so they honestly, other than the fact that villains are doing bad things that you don't want to happen, so you'd like them to go away so they stop doing their bad things, your sweet spot in terms of like, I don't care what happens to the world, I just want my meta currencies, is 3 villains. Because if you have 3, then you get a huge number of meta currencies, and if you have more than 3, then you don't get more, because 3 is the maximum. So that being said, I don't think most groups would like intentionally try to unleash 3 villains at the same time, due to the fact that that means that the villains are all advancing their plans, and chances are the group cannot actually keep pace with all three of the villains' plans, so they'll chase down one, and two others will be getting stronger, doing something else that they don't like.
There's a question about traits and then whether it costs anything. It doesn't cost anything to change your traits. It's just like, oh,
if you've decided that for
your
example,
character's motive was previously justice, and now their motive is anger.
Or like one of the example identities is Queenless Knight. If you were the Queen's Knight and then your queen died, you would probably become Queenless Knight.
Yes.
And you would not spend meta currency for that.
Yes.
It would be weird if they said, well, you don't have enough Fabula points, so you're still the Queen's Knight and not the Queenless Knight. But I don't have a queen. Well, that's too bad for you.
You also gain, another thing that you'll often gain are bonds, which are tied to specific emotions and represent a connection to specific PC or NPC. And those develop after each section.
Yes,
so
you can have admiration or inferiority towards someone, but not both. And which are like kind of similar to each other in certain ways. That's the one that we're going to get to the other ones that are opposites. But feeling inferior to someone kind of is very close to admiring them, just in a more negative light. Then there's loyalty versus mistrust, and affection versus hatred.
Yes.
And those are very opposite of each other. Now, you can have up to one out of every pair towards the same person. And if you have all three, or like some combination, like admiration, affection, but mistrust about your relative who you know you shouldn't trust, your strength of your bond is equal to the number of them that you have. 1, 2, or 3. You can also have bonds with some number of characters.
Yes, you can have up to 6 bonds at the same time.
That's right. And normally, when you rest and the villains are advancing their plots, you can also establish another bond. If I remember correctly, it's been a little while since we played. And you can have up to 6 bonds at once. Now, generally, depending on your character, the bonds have a few things you can do. There's like a sort of a Dark Knight-ish class that I can never remember the names of these classes. And I'm infamous in my group for not remembering Spiritist correctly, the healer class.
Yeah. Well, another thing too that the game says is that the names for the classes there are like the default names, but like in your setting, they're probably called something else, which adds another layer of, wait, what again?
So there's a Dark Knight that's constantly making hatred bonds with enemies and needs to have those type of bonds to use some of its cool abilities. But other than that, generally, you're in good shape if you have at least one bond that's going to show up a lot, such as with one of the other PCs that's of strength 3, so that you can get the most out of it, because you can sort of tap those bonds to add to your result based on the value of the bond. So someone who has a bond of 1, anytime that they were told they could establish a bond or empower a bond, if you have a 1 with 6 people, it's generally much worse for you mechanically than having a 3 with someone and then maybe whatever you want with the other ones.
Yeah.
But you really can do whatever you want there, and sometimes a bond may be established or broken not by your will when a bad thing happens to you later on. So having a 3 bond that could then get broken could make you lose a lot all at once, and so you could want to have some insurance.
So when we were playing, it was more like, hey, you know what do we think is going to be the biggest change in a character's relationship after this one? So, like, you know, we had multiple situations with our group. We're kind of chuckling about it, where it was like one character started to trust another party member less because they thought they were like a spy or something else. So there were a lot of like, I think what develops out of this is mistrust for your character. Oh, really? I think mistrust for your character is what develops out of this.
Everyone thinks that Linda's character is a spy for the technologically advanced nation of Highwind that is in the center of a bunch of other kingdoms and is known to have the best spies. Because she just kind of showed up and mysteriously helped resolve a conflict that was brewing. And Linda doesn't think that her character is a spy.
Yeah, but after all of their theories and me being like, yeah, no, my character's not a spy, you guys are funny, I was telling Mark that was like, you know, if there's an opportunity later for my character to become a spy, that would be hilarious. Yep.
So basically, you can either invoke your bond with a Fabula point, which is the game's meta currency. These are currency that you get in ways that, like, a lot of these other points, like hero points in some
Mm-hmm.
RPGs or fate points in Fate. You get these Fabula points when typically when something really awful happens to you, you get some Fabula points to compensate. When the villains
Mm-hmm.
do their scene, you get some Fabula points.
Like if you get knocked out in combat, or like you get a critical failure type thing.
That's right.
Then
There's a few other situations where you can get them too, but the critical failure is a pretty common one. And so you can use them either to invoke a bond to add that bond's value, and having a 3 is going to be pretty helpful to you right now. Or you can invoke a trait which allows you to re-roll the check.
so you can be like, well, it's like, but I am a master. I am like, a Highwind Master Tinkerer or whatever, and so like, I'm gonna re-roll this like check to craft something or what have you.
That's right. So you may have noticed that by now, since we're sort of going from front to back, we have not talked about what the actual die system is. That's because Fabula Ultima managed to get to this entire point, more or less. It does mention which kind of dice you need.
Dice.
It
Yes.
does. It does mention which ones you need.
Yes.
And it tells you how to roll them. But it did not go deeply into the check resolution mechanic until later on.
Yes.
You kind of are learning more about the narrative. You're learning more about what your characters mean from like their perspective of their bonds and who their identity is. Because notice, we didn't talk about the classes and skills yet, or the check mechanics. It goes into their level of classes and skills after this.
Yes.
And this is where we start talking about the way that checks work. So let me explain. It is a 2-die system. Now, I believe that's common in Japanese tabletop RPGs, that a lot of them use some kind of a 2d6. And Fabula Ultima uses something that's also a 2d6 plus bonus, plus flat modifier, which is common there. But it's not always d6
Not always
in
D6s,
Fabula Ultima.
yes.
It uses 2 dice. They can be of any size. So that's a little bit different than the typical tabletop Japanese RPG, or the sort of like Powered by the Apocalypse or other games that do 2d6. This can be 2 dice of any size. In fact, the d6 is your worst case scenario,
Yes.
more or less.
So the
or
character...
actually, technically, can you do a d4?
No, the game
right?
doesn't have
That's
D4s.
what I thought. D6 is the worst.
The game in many cases, D12 is gonna be as high as you go. D20s are used for like other weird stuff.
Usually, you either have to be buffed or leveled up quite a bit to even have a d12.
Yes. So the 4 attributes are dexterity, insight, might, and willpower. And when you look at rolling checks, generally a check is going to be described as some combination of those two. So, like, if something is super about balancing and nimbleness and poise, then, it might be dexterity plus dexterity. You rolled your dexterity dice twice. Or if it's something about, like, if it's something that requires you to, like, open up a locked mechanism and you need to, like, carefully observe what's going on but also be dexterous, then maybe that might be your dexterity plus your insight. And
That's right.
later on there's a lot of examples of
So
like what
willpower
things it would be.
is kind of like, if you're used to D&D or Pathfinder, is kind of like charisma in a lot of ways. It's like your force of will.
It's also like the spellcasting-y stat in some ways.
It depends on which spellcaster you are.
Yeah.
But most spellcasters do at least some willpower.
Yeah.
They often do willpower plus insight, but it's possible to be rolling something else because some of the spellcasters are a little bit weird. Insight is kind of like a perception and some of intelligence and some of wisdom from a perspective of like a D&D or Pathfinder. Might has constitution and strength, and dexterity is
dexterity. Yep.
So that's easy enough. Now, I like to talk about like where is the difficulty point for the GM, and you might think that figuring out which attributes these checks are meant to be at is a difficulty point, because you kind of have to come up with, is it going to be double of the same one? That's kind of an advantage for someone who's min-maxed that stat.
But also very difficult for someone who doesn't.
That's right. Can I find any way to use 2 different attributes? Is this easy enough or not? And my little brother, when he was looking at it, was like, this seems like it would be hard to determine. And he's sometimes bounced off other RPGs where it's too wishy-washy and it comes down to the GM to Mother May I him if he can use his highest skill. But we, with a very short time of explaining what they were and going through a few corner cases, or just basic use cases, went through and I gave a little questionnaire to everybody who was playing with some of the examples in this book. And pretty much everyone was able to guess all of them correctly and match them with very little prompting. And I found as the GM it was not hard to determine which of these they were. And it did not feel like I was being arbitrarily nice or mean when I was using stats. It felt very clear and satisfying to assign them.
So it's sort of like, does this task have a physical element? Does this task, if so, is it more of like a nimbly one or like a bashy strength or endurance one? Do
you have to think about how you're doing it?
And if you do, and if so, is it more like reasoning it out or like, discipline and charm and willpower and things like that?
Like, insight is going to be more of like thinking about how you do it, whereas willpower might be like having to be determined and do it over and over again. Might be like willpower plus might for if it's physically demanding as well.
Yes.
So, it's not that hard once you've done it a few times and looked at the examples. I think that this is not something that will trip you up.
And while classes are mentioned a little bit here, I think it would make sense more to talk about those when we get to
that
section.
They're barely mentioned.
Because they're not mentioned that much. Then
you also have 3 currencies that are not meta currencies, that are in-game. The hit points, mind points, which we always call magic points.
But they're mind points, but they're totally used for magic-like stuff.
And inventory points, IP, which are sort of an abstract measure of what consumable resources that you have on hand.
So you don't define what consumables you have until the moment that you use them.
That's right. And that's very important for especially some of the classes that play around with IP as their main currency. There's also 2 different defenses. Defense, which is dexterity-based, and magic defense, which is insight-based. And so you use your stat for dexterity for your defense, unless you have an armor that lets you replace it, and then you can add for your shield or any other modifiers. And similarly, use insight for magic defense, and there's not really armor that replaces that. There's armor that adds to it, and shields that add to it. So, insight is one that if you don't pay attention to, you will get wrecked by magic.
Yes.
There's also initiative modifier. So, initiative is one of the things it's a little bit wonky. It works. Basically, somebody on your team is chosen to be the initiative person, usually the one with the best initiative, and everybody else assists them and gives them a bonus. And I now can't remember whether you have to define ahead of time who the person is or you just find out when you roll, but what I've seen is that because only the main person's initiative is what really matters, it was Linda in this case, is the designated initiative person who takes all the initiative items and
focuses on being good at these things that make your initiative high.
Everybody else takes things that give them initiative penalties.
And then takes initiative penalties, and it doesn't matter.
They take initiative penalties because you can get good benefits in exchange for initiative penalties, and they hardly matter at all for anyone except the main initiative person.
Yes.
Because you roll it against a difficulty that's sort of an averaged out result for the enemy team, and if you succeed, your team starts first. If you fail, the other team starts first.
And then you alternate back and forth.
It's an interleaved initiative. It's common in some types of TTRPGs like Lancer, and MCDM is doing that, where one side goes, then the other side goes, then one side goes, then the other side goes. And if one of the sides runs out, then the other team will run the rest of their people.
Of course, it's not always one character than another character, because in this game, your more powerful villains and mini-bosses get more than one turn.
And Turgerman says they did change it in the recent book, so you don't even roll unless the opponent is a villain. The PC just automatically start first. So, in that case, it makes initiative even more of a bit of a trade-off that you can take a penalty to it, if you only roll it some of the time. It is a little bit weird, but going back and forth between teams is usually really fun and tactical in initiative, and it turns out to be so in Fabula Ultima as
there's
well.
a mention there about like the cap for IP, and the cap for IP is indeed pretty low.
The cap for IP is quite low unless you get something that raises the cap, which certain classes do.
But those classes also have special things they want to do with their IP.
Well, only one of them does.
But there's others that, right, I guess that's true.
There are several that add IP as one of their base benefits, but only one of them actually has...
The one I was put, yes.
Well, you were playing a bunch of them so that you could raise your IP.
That's true. That's right. That's right.
Linda was the IP person. We'll get into that when we get into...
the actual classes, yes, indeed.
So, there's your equipment, and then there's money, which is called Zenith. Like Zenith, but without the H. So, at this point is actually when they define checks and how they work. I defined them in advance for you the moment that we started talking about the attributes. This is another one of those games that a lot of RPGs have a rule where it's just like, look, if you know you're going to succeed at this and there's nothing interesting to do, that you just don't need to roll a check.
And on the opposite hand, if someone says, I'm going to jump to the moon... It literally uses that example in here. You don't have to roll a check because the character that's not something they can do.
That's correct. The jump to the moon is like a kind of thought experiment that every tabletop RPG kind of has to think about when you're designing it. So the game master is the one who asks for checks. In some games, it's the other way around. Players will ask for checks, or the game master is sometimes not allowed to ask for checks, and the players have to make a move.
Only the game master can ask for a check. Players can never do so. And part of the reason there is that, like, for checks, there's an expectation of checks should have relevant failure. If there is no way, if failure cannot make the PC situation worse, then there's no point in rolling a check. Or if the character is not interacting under pressure and can keep trying, there's no point in rolling a check. This is absolutely true in every RPG. you know?
So, doubles that are 6 or higher is a crit, and double ones is a fumble. So, in many Japanese tabletop RPGs, boxcars, 2 6s on D6 can be a crit, and 2 1s can be a fumble. Here, it's 6 or above, which means if you do roll 2 D6s, the worst possible scenario, you have that 1 in 36 chance, but your chance can be potentially higher.
Because if you're rolling 2d8s, for example, then double 6, double 7s, and double 8s are all.
That's correct. In fact, your best bet for crits is actually d10s, because of the fact that double 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, and 10s will do it. But with d12s, even though there's another number, 2 more numbers that you can match, it becomes less likely that they match at all.
Yeah.
There's also some weird special abilities to get some of the other doubles to turn into crits that one of the classes has. But for the most part, you're looking at a maximum critical chance of... let me see. So it's a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, which is, I believe, 5% with 2 d10s. If your die sizes don't match, your chance of critting goes way down in most cases, other than the fact that d6 is the worst.
Yeah.
So, for instance, like, you might think d10s are better, and they are, but 2 d8s is much more likely to crit than a d8 and a d10.
Yeah. So, whenever a critical or a success or a fumble happens, it gets into a mechanic called opportunity, which is an unexpected twist in the story. If you critically succeed, then you get to do a favorable opportunity for you. And if you fumble, then your opponent gets an opportunity.
That's right. So, opportunities, unlike figuring out which check things are, opportunities are one of the skill points that I will say... for new GMs are going to be somewhere that might trip you up. So if you are trying to come up with an opportunity, there's a list of sample opportunities, and that is excellent. Some RPGs are just like, there's an opportunity. You have to figure it out. There's a list of them. It's a good, lengthy list. You can either give a +4 on your next check that you or an ally performs. You can cause one of the minor status debuffs that lowers the die size for your enemy by
one of their attributes.
By 1 step. You can create a bond towards something. You can add another emotion to one of your bonds. You can cause a social faux pas. Someone you can like gain admiration from someone and gain their favor. You can get some information. There can be an item that is destroyed, lost, or stolen or left behind. You can progress a clock, which we'll get into. They're kind of like in Blades of the Dark.
Like a timer until something happens.
Yes. A plot twist where something suddenly appears on the scene. You can discover vulnerabilities or traits as if you scanned the creature, or you can amass some motivations. Now, the player is certainly allowed to suggest an opportunity, but the GM has final say on whether it's appropriate to the situation, because sometimes their opportunity does not make sense in the current situation. Now, one thing that I have noticed is times when I have asked for an opportunity as a GM and the players got a crit, and they looked through the entire list and there was nothing that they thought made sense in the situation, and I agreed except for the +4, and they weren't too super thrilled about getting the +4 on the next check, and so they were a little let down because maybe just previously, if they had gotten a critical, there was a clock that they would have wanted to fill up that they then had already filled. So I would say that there's nothing a GM can do to raise your skill on this, because the players are the ones who are actually coming up with the opportunity in this case.
But one of the things that you did think based on that is that it may make sense, for example, instead of having a clock that has where it says, okay, the enemies start at 0 out of 4 toward their goal. Say that the enemies start at 2 out of 6 toward their goal. So it's possible to knock them back farther from where they started.
I discovered that later on.
Yeah.
Because clocks are basically just Pathfinder 2 victory points where you're trying to go up or down in them. And one of the opportunities is you can lower an enemy's clock or advance one of your own by 2. So if you always create clocks that are a little bigger than you actually need and have them pre-filled, so you wanted the enemies to take 4 ticks to fill it, so you start at 4 out of 8 or 2 out of 6, that allows a crit to unadvance.
Oh, Turkman in chat's players stole the villain's weapon twice.
That's hilarious. Because my players definitely had a situation where they crit when the clock was already at 0, and they're like, well, great, we don't want this clock to advance, but it's already at 0, so that doesn't help us. And then later, they didn't crit again.
Yeah, because we had, there were relatively small clocks that we needed to keep turning back. It was right now they're good, but... Yeah.
Yep. So that is one thing you can do as the GM on those. It's something that, if you have complicated enough situations, it might be easier to handle, but some of these options, like faux pas, or favor, obviously won't apply in a lot of combats. So combats are where you're going to run into potential issues. In a lot of other cases where you get a crit, it'll be easy because there'll be 4 or 5 things the players might want to find out. Absolutely. I also definitely took to sometimes when the players looked annoyed, suggesting something, even though the players are supposed to pick the opportunity, where I was like, well, maybe I can give you some information or a clue based on what you did. I can come up with a reason in my mind that I can do that, even though the player thought it was unreasonable because they didn't know.
No, they didn't know what the situation
was. I was doing. So
it just seemed to us, it was like, oh, this kind of just seems like a random encounter on a bridge. I don't see how this would necessarily.
Right. And so basically that's the situation. Now, obviously, checks have a difficulty level. That's like a DC in D&D or Pathfinder. It's just the number you need to achieve when you roll your 2 dice and add your modifier.
And there is some standard difficulty, 7 for an easy thing that anyone with a bit of training or natural talent should be able to do.
7 is so easy that the worst possible PC who is not being currently debuff with poison or something like that. Actually, even if you are, D6 is the lowest you can go. It can't debuff you to a D4. So the worst possible character still has greater than a 50% chance of doing it.
Yes.
It is typically pathetically easy for the characters. It's probably considered easy by the universe in general because the characters are above average for the universe.
Yeah. And the thing with 7 is that if you wanted to put a difficulty under 7, then the question is, why are you having them roll a check? This is so this one also works well when it's sort of everyone needs to succeed, and whoever doesn't succeed might have something bad happen or something like that.
That's right. 10, which is normal, is something that it starts getting a little bit tricky because characters always start with basically a baseline of D8 in everything, but you can bump up one of your stats to a D10 in exchange for a D6 in another stat. So, in order to comfortably be able to say you have a greater than 50% chance on this, you either need to have used your classes to get a bonus, found like a special item that gives you a bonus, or have D10 and D8 at least as the two dice that you're rolling, which if you think about what I just said, you're never going to average to having D10 and D8. Now, if you have the best person roll, you probably can do that. But the normal check is not actually necessarily that easy for a character to achieve. It gives you a lot of uncertainty, and it's a really nice sweet spot for the normal.
And that's why the next thing in the rule says, not sure, go with 10. Because 10 is going to work in a lot of circumstances. There is an ability for characters to assist each other and to spend their Fabula point meta currency to do better on these sorts of things.
If you have a strong enough bond to get a +3, then that will already shift the factors for you a huge amount. So then hard is a 13 and very hard is a 16. Very hard is basically incredibly difficult to do it consistently. But it's possible, even for a starting character who took all 8s, all D8s, to do it with any of their 2 ability scores. So it's something that's like almost always achievable unless you're rolling your weak stats. But that is never going to be super easy for you unless you've totally min-maxed that thing. So basically, that is how checks are resolved, which is very, very important to the game. And I think that we don't need to get too much further with checks, but it might be good to talk about clocks right about now. So clocks, which you may have seen in Blades in the Dark and many other games, are essentially a way to visualize a point pool that needs to be filled up for partial successes in order to get to a full success.
You can see some here on this page.
That's right. So clocks basically just mean you need more than one success to do this, and get X successes.
So they're generally like drawn as like a circle with like some little pie slices cut out of it that you can shade in and erase. That's right. The visual I use here, and I've seen in Blades of the Dark and in a lot of other games that I've seen.
That's right. In every game that has clocks, there's a major question of, is this a skill factor for the GM? Is this going to be hard for the GM? I would say that Blades in the Dark, which very intentionally give you almost no guidance on how to do the clocks, except for the guidance that it tells you that it did give it to you. And it's like, you might be expecting, Blades in the Dark says something to the effect of, you might be expecting some advice on clocks here, but we intentionally didn't give it to you so that your group can establish your own sort of feel and idiom that's distinct from everyone else's. Which, it is true that for every group, you're going to want a different pacing, but I felt as a GM of Blades in the Dark that Blades in the Dark did an amazing job of onboarding me to be able to run it quickly and without prep, which is one of the promises of that system, except that by giving me no baseline for clocks, it actually made it pretty challenging on clocks. Fabula Ultima gives you a little bit better than that because of the fact that not only does Fabula Ultima give a few rule of thumbs about clocks, if you look further in the book, there are examples of them using clocks in one of the creatures that you come across, and you can use that as a baseline to sort of bootstrap what you're doing with clocks.
Yeah, generally with clocks, if there's a clock that represents succeeding to build towards something, whenever you succeed at a relevant check, it advances. Or if you critically succeed, if you get critical success, you can spend opportunities to advance them. Or if you succeed by a large amount, you can advance by more as well. And then in the same way, if it's a clock that's about failure, counting up until something bad happens, then it fills by more whenever you fail more.
And a fumble could be used to fill a bad clock or to remove from a good clock as the opportunity that the GM takes. Because a fumble is an opportunity for the GM, whereas a crit is an opportunity for the players. Obviously, this means the players are going to get way more opportunities unless they're always rolling d6s, because only with 2 d6s are you at, like, an even odds. Actually, d6 and d8 is the only, or d6 and d8, or d6, d10, d6, d12, d6 and another larger die is the only situation where the GM has a higher chance of getting an opportunity than the players.
An example here is while sneaking her way through the monster-infested corridors of an ancient castle, Valia rolls a 6 on a check with a difficulty level of 10. The GM fills 2 sections on the ambush clock. One for her failure and another because she failed to check by 3 or more.
So as you can see, it gives very clear instructions for how to run the clocks, which makes it much easier to handle the situation with clocks than in situations where it doesn't. Now, is this at a trade-off where you can't establish sort of your own idiom? Well, I mean, kind of. You still can, but I prefer it when there's at least some baseline, so I can decide if I'm going to voluntarily move away from the baseline to where my group wants to go. My group can tell if we don't like the baseline and we'll move it. Whereas if we don't have one, we don't know necessarily if we're really far off or if we're not just not sure about the system in the first place. So I do like that they included some pretty substantial rules for the clocks that are in here, and I feel like they make it easier to run clocks in other games if you have a baseline for clocks. So bonds we kind of already talked about, those come up next, and then they talk about conflict scenes, which could be not only fights, but other kinds of conflicts. They go in rounds where you alternate based on initiative, as
social
we
conflicts,
mentioned before.
Infiltrations, complicated skill challenges, all sorts of things.
That's right. Now, it's important to note that just because you chose to have a certain character act first in, like, round 1, doesn't mean they have to act first in round 2. You can have anyone act whenever you want them to.
This is incredibly important for things like having your guardian character put up their ability to block or bringing in your healer at the key time and things like that.
That's correct. So there are certain abilities that last until your next turn or that refresh on your next turn. And that therefore, it is very wise to keep the character who has that duration in reserve until the best possible moment to make that thing end or refresh. So for a buff, you could cast the buff first that lasts until your next turn, and then don't go until last in the next round, so all of your allies get to use the buff twice. For the Guardian's ability, that's kind of like a reaction to hop in front of an attack and force it to attack them. If you haven't used it yet, and you're on the next turn when you could act at any time, having the Guardian delay until they do use it, and then immediately go, allowing them to use it again, can potentially allow you to block 2 of the attacks in the same turn. So manipulating your initiative is one of the most crucial decisions that you're going to make in a combat in Fabula Ultima. Now, as with any, you choose what order things go in, it there's huge benefits in terms of strategy and tactics. The drawback that all of these have is that you can wind up with a committee thing or analysis paralysis, or with one player who has figured out the correct ordering, and maybe they're right, but also they tell people which time to go. Additionally, it can lead to players having to, like, converse about each other's actions more than normal because of the fact that they have to figure out their order and be like, I want to go now and do this. And the other person's like, well, I want to do the thing Y. And then that also has to be now. And then player A says, well, but my thing X has to be now and I don't have a fallback. Whereas you could do thing Z if you wait and go later instead of thing Y, which I agree could only happen now. And I don't have an other option for thing X. So our group was very harmonious about this and developed standard operating procedure. But as with any game that does this, you can wind up with a with some kind of situation. So know your players and know how that's going to work.
So one of the next things that the game talks about is space and distance. This isn't a game that uses a battle grid. Far from it.
It doesn't even have a close and far zone. Basically, you can move an infinite amount of distance within the round. You're just everywhere that is considered within bounds of the fight unless you retreated from the fight. So
the only difference between, like, melee attacks and range attacks is that some things may be like, oh, it's flying, you can't target it with melee attacks.
Or they just may have some special ability against melee or range, such as being flying. And that's it.
Or, like, having some ability to deflect range attacks.
Right. For instance, the archery character can deflect enemies' range attacks. But basically as a free action by spending a bunch of mind points. So if that's your only thing that costs mind points with that character, you can really go to town on ranged attacks.
And if your locations where things are going on are like preposterously far away from each other, then you might possibly split things up into like 2 battles. There's a battle over here where these PCs are and a battle over here where these other PCs are. But generally, like, by the time you've chosen to make the engagement, you are considered to be at engagement distance.
So the basic actions in combat are attack, where you attack with melee ranged attack. Equipment, where you switch around your equipment other than armor because that takes too long. Guard, where you basically spend your turn doing nothing except guarding. You take half damage from all damage types. You get a +2 bonus on opposed checks against your opponents. And you can cover another creature. So you basically select one of your allies, and nobody can melee that ally because you're standing in front of them when you guard them. So this is an example of where melee matters.
Yes.
So if you have one person doing that, and then the archer kind of character that can shoot arrows out of the air, or it may be the same person, then only magic is really going to be able to get through to this one person that you are bodyguarding.
Yes.
Then you can hinder, where you do a difficulty 10 check to do one of those debuffs that lowers a die by 1 size. You could spend inventory points to use an item. You can work towards an objective to try to fill up or deplete a clock. You can cast a spell. You can study the opponent using insight to learn more information. You can use a special skill from your class, or you can do some weird action that the GM has negotiated with you about. And those are basically the only things that you do in combat, because since there's an other category,
then it fits into that if you have
else.
to. But when we were playing, I don't know if we really even had that come up, because those categories are generally
given that fulfill an objective is already
so
one
broad,
of them.
yeah.
Then you don't really need other very often.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the currencies in the game. So there's hit points. When those reach 0, when they reach half, you go into crisis, which is like...
I guess we should probably talk about group checks, because we skipped over that.
Oh, yeah, I guess we did. But we kind of talked about them before, which is why I had avoided them. But yeah, group checks are checks where like the entire group is working together, and
so you have one leader who performs the check, and then everyone else who's helping out is going to tries like a difficulty 10 check to support them, and if they support, then they get a +1.
That's what I was talking about for initiative. So as I remember, where only one person is actually rolling initiative.
Yeah, but it is something that can come up a fair bit, so it's worth talking a little bit more about how that worked.
That's right. So with hit points, when you get to half, you're in crisis. That's like Bloodied in 4th edition D&D, where it is a kind of a marker that you can use to do a bunch of special effects. For example, there is a summoner class that has really expensive summons, but if you're in crisis, you can get a bunch of level up abilities, which my brother did, to greatly decrease the cost. So he often was like, wait, stop healing me with when Linda was doing uncontrollable AoE heals, because it actually put up the cost of his spells, and he wanted to be in crisis.
So I can't control what I'm doing. It's random alchemy.
When you reach 0 hit points, your character is out of the fight, if it happens to you, and some bad consequence happens, and you actually get some Fabula points for later on. If an opponent reaches 0, they are defeated unless they're a villain, in which case they escape. Unless
but then they have to spend a villain point to escape.
We mentioned that earlier.
Yes. So there was a thing in chat that someone mentioned about about having like a token that people can show that's like I'd like to go now, I want to go later, I don't care when I go, so that like people, they don't have to be like, okay, who wants to go if there's only one person who has the I would like to go now please token up.
Yes, that's one way to handle it. If your group knows the procedure, it can get easier, although then you do run the risk of people thinking that it's more mechanistic. Like in our group, everyone knew that the Guardian wanted to go later until he was forced to use his jump in front of, and then he wanted to go right then. And he had to go right then. I had no
complaints about it being mechanistic because it kept us alive. To be like, that's when the Guardian goes, and then, like, I will heal people when they need healing, or what have you.
Right. So, mind points, nothing bad happens when they go to 0, or when they go below half. They are just, you use them, and you use them for special abilities. So, there's also inventory points, which nothing bad happens other than you don't have the inventory points, and you can pay Zenith to get more of them, or you can find them in, or there's various class abilities that can allow you to get them too. So the consequences of getting to 0. Oh, right. Also, technically, you can choose to go out in a blaze of glory and die if you reach 0.
But the player has to choose that they want that to happen.
Yes. Otherwise, you surrender, and you either you'll get a consequence from the GM. You may be forced to change your theme to some kind of really emo theme.
Like anger, doubt, guilt, or vengeance.
The enemy might get to make a decisive move. You might lose something important to you. You might be forced to erase one of your bonds and replace it with a bond chosen by the game master. And this is where you might lose your strong bond if you min-max the strong bond. You might become separated from your allies. So basically, when you rest, you're going to be recovering all of your hit points and mind points, strengthening a bond in a resting scene, and then all of the villains are going to be advancing their plots.
Well, if you want, you would need a magical tent if you're out in the wilderness.
Which costs IP.
Yes.
That is true. So, in Fabula Ultima, there's various elemental, or some of them are not elemental, damage types that you can either be resistant to, taking half damage, weak to, taking double damage, or immune, taking no damage. There's actually absorb, where you get healed by it.
Yes.
So, it's physical, air, bolt, which is electricity, dark, earth, fire, ice, light, and poison are the damage types in the game. And there's a variety of different ways to deal with those different damage types depending on your classes.
Then it gets into talking about the status effects. So if we talked about sort of the minor ones that will temporarily reduce one of your die sizes by 1, there are also major ones that temporarily decrease 2.
2 dice, each by 1.
You can also have both of them at the same time, which really messes you up.
If you have them on a corresponding ability die, then it gets decreased twice. And pretty much it's going to be a D6 unless you have something else going on there. Now, if you're already a D6, then these literally don't do anything. So, like, if you just have a D6 dexterity because you're wearing heavy armor, then the slow condition doesn't affect you other than, like, enemies may be able to do something to you because you're
If they
slow.
have a do something to characters that are slowed ability.
That's right. So we already talked about ways to spend your Fabula points and villains, which are the next thing that are in the book. We talked a little bit about inventory points, and you can spend money to get them back in towns. There's also some other ways to do it. Now, the world map is a kind of interesting and different thing. A lot of these we talked about, and we're like, well, there's like clocks and other RPGs. The world map here is meant to evoke a JRPG world map. And so you're moving along a map sheet using travel days, at which point, basically, like in this case, like in other RPGs, you do roll to see if you have like a random encounter or a discovery when you're moving along the map. But other than that, certain other things can happen during your during your map journey. That it matters if you're like riding on a chocobo or an airship or some kind. I mean, an off-brand chocobo.
Yes, totally not chocobo.
Totally not a chocobo. And there's some classes that can get more IP as you're moving along on the world map as well. So it very much is similar in some ways to Hexploration, but it's always zoomed out on this world map, which makes it feel more like a JRPG.
Where you see, like, the oversized relative to the map characters walking along. Absolutely.
That's right. So Dungeons is one where it gets pretty interesting because this is a game that very much knows what it wants to be and kind of strongly declares that in most cases. But in Dungeons is the one place where it hedges a lot. Because of the fact that I got the sense that the game wanted to kind of go along with the other way that it normally runs and to run on one of the different ways that the dungeons are described here, which is dungeon scenes. It is, in fact, the first method that is mentioned. And that's where you run a succession of key moments for the dungeon that are like the most interesting things that happened in the dungeon, which was running it more like the rest of the game. But I think that, like, this is one case where the game has its theme that is used in other places, but there was clear acknowledgement that actual JRPG video games are not like that at all.
Where they have you are instead going to go into every nook and cranny and try to go the wrong way as much as possible first to find the secret chest that is hidden behind the curtain and etc. and push every button, etc. etc.
And so therefore, the game kind of does say, okay, you can do that too. I have a feeling that being so completely laid out with it might like be a little bit jarring. That's not what I have done yet. They haven't had a big dungeon yet. They're about to go to their first one, so we'll see how it goes the next time that I run Fabula Ultima. But obviously, if you really want to get the JRPG feel of being in one of those dungeons, you're going to want to use the detailed exploration. Whereas if you want to, I think, jive more with the other rules of Fabula Ultima, use the first one that's listed there. There's also the interlude, which is even more fast-forwarded, where it's an interlude scene with a single group check, perhaps, for all of the obstacles, and otherwise you just kind of skip through it and just say that you were in the dungeon. Which you
describe sort of as like, oh, while you were traveling, you came across kind of like this random encounter location, and there are a few checks to see what you find there, and then the fact that it happened to be a dungeon is just satressing.
That's right. So spells in this setting are basically either going to be like basic spells or rituals. So rituals are a thing that your class might give you that lets you spend some very significant effort and resources to potentially do some major result that's based on a theme that your class's rituals can do. Spells are your bread and butter. You cast these in combat. They cost some number of mind points, and they do some very basic damage or healing or status effect or something like that. And basically, that's how they work. So a lot of them will...
Sometimes one of the things that spells will often have is a variable number of targets, and that'll be like, this costs 10 times the number of targets, magic points to use, for example.
That's right. And it deals... oftentimes when you're attacking in this game, you deal damage equal to the highest of your rolls on the die, plus a certain amount. So that also means a critical hit can do less damage if it's like 2 6s than just rolling a 10. Yes. Sometimes a lot less damage than just rolling a 10 that wasn't a critical and didn't match another die. Which is, I don't know, pretty interesting. So usually
So that means that having mismatched die isn't always like worse.
Because it's much worse for getting criticals, but it can having the bigger die makes you both more likely to succeed and more likely to deal additional damage. Now, when I say more likely to succeed, sort of, because doubles of 6 and above, or aka critical, automatically succeeds even if it doesn't achieve your result.
Yes.
So that means 2 6s, which is 12, beats a 16 or a 20. Or a 90. Obviously, don't do a 90. Don't even do above a 16.
In the same way it says, don't put a check for it if it's not something that they can succeed at and can fail at.
That's right.
In a meaningful way.
Usually, the big benefit of one of these spells is that it has a pretty high amount of base damage, and you can target multiple creatures, so you can get an action economy advantage if you're willing to spend lots of mind points on it. So, other than that, I think that goes through the basic game rules, so I don't want to go too deeply into all of the classes and talk about what all of them are and all of their special abilities. But we should talk about like sort of how broadly speaking, your characters typically start at level 5, and it's not one of those systems where it's like here's your class and that's your class. Instead, your character is going to have several classes at once. And they're going to choose whenever they level up which of those classes they want to advance, and advancing the class is going to give them an additional ability in that class or let them upgrade one of the abilities that they already had. So there's a lot of customization involved with characters where it's like, hey, do I want to improve my ability to be a guardian, or do I want to improve my ability to do like this tinkery alchemist stuff, or what do I want to focus on with my build? And here's another important thing about classes. That is really, like, when you think about classes in most tabletop RPGs, when we get into the part about building your character, classes are going to be one of the first things you're going to find. They're close to the last thing in the entire chapter here, and are not set off in their own chapter, which actually can sometimes make them hard to find unless you go backwards from the Game Master section in the book or bookmark the classes. And that is for an intentional reason, which is, like Linda said, you are a mix mash of classes. You have to be. You cannot single class in Fabula Ultima. In fact, you're typically, with some very small exceptions, you're foolish not to have the maximum number of classes that you're said to be allowed to have. Now, if those come last, what comes first? Well, world building, building your character's background, all of these kinds of things, the tone, the theme of the game, all these kind of things, even the inventory list of like basic weapons. Entirely all comes before you get to the classes.
See, because the reason that you want to have as many classes as possible is because you get a benefit just for having a class.
Yes. When you get your first level in a class, you will either get 5 mind points, 5 hit points, or 2 IP inventory points. And that benefit may not sound like anything to you because you've not played Fabula Ultima. And when we first saw it, it wasn't completely clear. But what makes it very clear is that when you put a level into any class, the only thing you get other than that first class benefit, which also can give you proficiencies, is a skill point that you can use to buy some skill from your class. For example, if you are a Guardian, you could buy a skill for a skill point that gives you 3 hit points.
Yes.
Now notice what I just said. Your first level in Guardian gives you 5 hit points and martial armor and martial shields. And a skill point, which you could use to buy 3 hit points. Your second level in Guardian could also buy 3 hit points. Now, this is not the best way to spend your skill up in Guardian. But the fact that there even is an option that only gives you 3 tells you how big it is to get 5 and potentially more by taking another class.
You can only have 3 classes you're working on at once until you like fully level up and master a class.
That's right. And so you must have at least 2 and can have up to 3. And in my opinion, almost always want to have 3 classes.
Yes.
Now, when you're mixing and matching, what I found to be the best with the characters that I've built is to figure out what your main theme of the thing that you want to do a lot of the time might be, and then see what other classes can help support that. And now, this actually might wind up with you not spending that many of your points in the class that is your main theme.
Yes.
For example,
my
Linda's
character spent most of her points in the rogue class to let her use an ability to steal more IP out of the souls of monsters so that she could fuel her ability to do weird alchemy a lot more often.
With the Tinker class.
Yes.
Basically, Linda's entire build was based on the Tinker class, which gave her a D20 random potion, some of which are extremely powerful. And it costs a bunch of IP. So
you roll like 2d20, and then you decide one of these I'm going to assign to my effect, and one of these and based on this random table, and one of them I'm going to assign to my target based on this random table. So
she could easily do something like fulfilling the entire party's MP or HP. For example, there's also a mulligan where you can do poison damage to the targets if you want, or do a very small amount of healing.
If you're like, welp, the only thing I can do with what I rolled is heal the enemy, I think I'm gonna mulligan.
Yes. Then you can mulligan and always do some poison damage or a little bit of healing. But the main point of Linda's character's build is that she only spent that 1 point in Tinker for a while. There's a lot of tempting things for her concept, which is highly based on Tinker. And if you look at the character, it's like, this is obviously a Tinker. I don't know what the other classes are from the outside. But almost all of her points were in Rogue because of the fact that Rogue's Steel ability lets you get back a number of IP equal to the number of points in Steel from any non-elite, non-boss opponent that you fight.
And then those elite and boss opponents give you items.
Yes, and your accuracy for stealing also goes up with points in Steel.
Yes.
So Linda had 1 point in Tinker, 1 point in Wanderer, which lets her regenerate IP when she's wandering around the world map, which is recommended as a dual up for Tinkerer, but the Thief one actually is not recommended in the book, which has some starting builds.
But it's so good.
We did not actually have that world map thing help Linda very often because she was usually getting most of hers from the Rogue. And then all the rest of her points were in Steel, and not only that, when she leveled up, she continued to put more points into Steel. because she wanted to get to the point where stealing once could outpace the cost of using her potions once.
Yes.
And that way, she had a very good tempo for the potions. And so that's an example of one of these characters you can build, and it's a very flexible system. The other character that we had was an Arcanist, which is a summoner, who was crossed with a monk and also an Entropist class, mostly for a lucky number ability that lets you like sort of cash a very high or good for doubling roll and then pull it out later once per scene. The player of that character also often is like, maybe I should have taken the Elementalist for the attack spell accuracy instead of the Entropist for the third class. His main focus is on his Arcanist class, where he's buying the ability to, when he's in crisis, decrease the cost of his summons. Summons often do something that's like an AoE, no saving throw or attack roll. There's no such thing as a saving throw. Big damage. So it's just like, it'll definitely hit everything. It does big damage. It's very expensive. And so he gets to where he can just do that quickly. And it creates a magic circle that gives him a free action cast of a spell when he dismisses the summon to deal the damage. And he can chain that into like a very high amount of damage every round that is sustained by both his reduction in the cost and Linda randomizing healing his MP some of these times.
And both that character and my character were pretty squishy, so we relied upon the Guardian, who was super good at bodyguarding people, but also like had the Fury class to provoke and taunt people into attacking. It was basically like built around the idea of I am tank, attack me, not the squishies.
Right.
And I will be fine.
Also, because of the way that that character worked, he had a counterattack ability from the Weapon Master class that when an enemy attacked him, which they sometimes were forced to do, and rolled, I think it's an even total result, it was either even or odds, he gets to attack back. But his damage is, unfortunately for him, basically minimum damage. And it's so low that he also took an ability from the Weapon Master class that lets you replace an attack with a debuff. So he's like, well, this damage is so bad that I might as well replace it with the debuff because it's a free action for them attacking me, which they have to do. And
now I debuff them. Yes, exactly.
Yes. So these are the kinds of builds you can put together.
So exactly. So you're like, what do I want to generally do? And that character is like, I want to force them to attack me as much as possible. And since they're attacking me anyway, I want to gain advantages.
But he still took 2 things in Weapon Master class and not all of them in Guardian. You can find the best things to take. Also, because he had these 3 melee-ish classes, he got a ton of hit points from that. Now, one thing to note about the combat system in the game is that it talks about the default being that enemies target randomly, but you can choose to do something else if you want. I have found that the easy mode of enemies targeting randomly, if you have a competent team with a Guardian in it, and some healing, especially with Linda's weird random healing.
And I also got a healing companion with her too.
But if they target randomly, it is in some cases ridiculously easy to win because of the fact that enemies have a chance to target the bodyguard on their own, and then when they do target someone else, the bodyguard can jump in front of it.
Yes.
On the other hand, if you always go after the soft targets, which is what I do when I'm running Fabula Ultima, I would consider it like a video game's hard mode. Like, it is fairly hard. And you'll feel that things are like a little bit narrow and that you're squeaking by in some situations, mainly because of the Guardian's ability to help you. So I'm not sure if there's a middle ground to that where you like have them not be completely random, but have them not completely focus fire on the weaker targets after figuring out how hard to hit the hard targets are. But maybe you could find one that's like that. Our group actually really enjoyed the kind of hard mode feel. I mean, they always won anyway because of coming up with better and better tactics, and they recruited
but I think also,
an
like,
NPC to shoot archery attacks out of the air.
It's because we enjoyed the puzzle of like, hey, you know, how do we make a really powerful engine?
Yes.
And I think that like a group that doesn't have like the healing and the protection and stuff like that, having more of a random targeting system.
I think that for most groups, if you even have a Guardian doing that at all, that the random targeting is going to be pretty, like, is going to be pretty weak.
Mm-hmm.
But that the ruthless targeting is going to be too hard, so you may want to try to find something in the middle.
So maybe it's something like, okay, they're never going to choose to target the person who is clearly a walking fortress, but from among the rest of y'all, they'll attack randomly or something.
Or you could do something, just come up with your own algorithm. Mm-hmm. Here's a suggestion that you could maybe try. Roll randomly among all of the characters and attack them. If this attack misses, roll randomly again. If it hits or they're injured, everybody attacks that person who was injured, regardless of if it was actually someone who's very hard to hit and you just lucked out, or if it was someone who was easy to hit. And if they ever get back to full hit points, basically if everyone's at full hit points, maybe roll randomly, and if somebody's damaged, you just focus fire. So that's somewhere in between always going for the easiest target and just like sometimes arbitrarily attacking the guardian that your enemy just cannot hit. And this is true because defenses are very powerful in Fabula Ultima. If you build a guardian with 2 shields and the appropriate armor, you can wind up in a situation where you're sitting at 15 for your like physical defense and your magic defense. Somewhere around there anyway. I'd have to look at it again, but I believe that that's correct. Mm-hmm. And with 15 for your physical defense and your magic defense, the enemies are going to have a lot of trouble hitting you.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, Math Guy Dave calls that algorithm I just came up with the shark algorithm. That's legit. A good description of it.
So, so generally after a fight concludes, then you're ready to move on, and when you finish a session, you are able to level up. The amount of XP that you get in this game is based off of how many Fabula points that you spent during the game and how many villain points that the villain spent. So
that's right.
You don't want to... So there's a push and pull with the meta currency, right? Because if you hoard it, then you're not going to level up. But if you spend all of it, then you're not going to have much ability to get yourself out of a jam in the next session.
I find that to be very interesting as someone who hoards things too much. And my little brother likes milestone leveling, but I convinced him that we needed to do this based on the normal rules at least a few times so that we could see if that had a beneficial effect on people using their Fabula points more. And I think that it did.
Yeah. Definitely, I used it more often. Like, it was, as long as the check feels important or significant, it didn't have to be like a life or death type thing. It just had to be like, it would be nice to succeed at this one. For my character's theme or whatever.
So
especially because like when you're spending those points, you're usually being like, well, my character is some reason why their theme or identity would make them better at this particular thing, and so then you try and you can do better.
Yes. There's also a very cool sort of item building guidelines for the special reward items that the players get that you can't necessarily buy in stores. It's fairly intuitive and easy to build. And it's very cool and gives you a lot of variety with just options that I think will feel interesting without being too mechanically complicated. The only thing I will say about it in terms of something that's a little weird is that the weapons, there's a particular thing you can buy on a weapon that is not very expensive, especially when you get later on in the game, and does not sort of like use up any kind of slot for the weapon that increases its damage. And some of the sample weapons use that, but not all. Mm-hmm. And the amount that it increases the damage by, assuming the weapon was already martial, because if you go past a certain point, it becomes martial if it wasn't already and harder to use.
Yes.
Is so high that it makes the weapon just vastly better than some more expensive properties that make the weapon deal like slightly more damage than that, but only to one creature type, and it uses the weapon slot. And so, like, I found that all of the weapons that had that property built into them and charged the extra few hundred for them were the best weapons of their level, slightly. And so I would either like look into maybe just either adding that to all of the weapons and raising their price by a little bit like that, or keep that in mind and make sure that the weapons you give out that don't have that, or add it to none. Or if you do it to some and not the others, make sure that they have very weird properties such that there's some major use case for them, such as doing an elemental damage type that might be the enemy's weakness, or something like that. But you definitely are not going to feel happy if you wind up with one of them that had the plus flex mod for +3 damage, and another one that has the more expensive +5 damage to only one creature type.
Yes.
Because even if that creature type comes up, if they didn't know it in advance, the action to switch weapons is not necessarily going to be worth it as much, especially since that weapon was more expensive. Other than that, though, considering they made a system that has like maybe not dozens, but over a dozen different modifiers you can throw on, it makes it simple, quick, and easy to build new weapons and armor. And I didn't see anything else that struck me as being like a either mandatory, although of course since the GM builds it, it's not necessarily mandatory, or like that it would throw off which things that you wanted to use.
Before this, there was some general advice on like how to make a cool villain, how to make a cool dungeon, and stuff like that. So
yep.
That's worth checking out too, and also can be applicable to other games.
So monster design in the game is generally fairly simple. If they're an elite or a boss, they get more sort of love and detail. And there's a whole section with an example evil wizard villain that was created. But normally, you just need their dice, whether they have a bonus on defense and magic defense, their resistances and weaknesses, hit points, mind points, initiative modifier, and their basic attacks and special abilities.
And there's a bestiary in the back with plenty of examples too.
That's right. You can see this totally not bomb, off-brand bomb, as well as the acorn sprite, Linda's
Pixie,
companion from her Wanderer class, the acorn pixie.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bunch of stuff and some good examples of bosses that I felt gave enough information to figure out how to either build a boss or to modify one out of...
Also, the art's super cute.
Yes, and very JRPG-ish at the same time. It's either build one from scratch or modify one out of an existing creature. And I found it fairly intuitive and relatively easy to create a monster, even just on the fly if I needed to, because the players were fighting against something. Now, the one thing that my brother, at least, sometimes got annoyed by the vulnerabilities, resistances, and immunities that are on the printed creatures in the back. He would often just be like, "What?"
That's not weak to light.
When he used his light magic, because he was a healer type person who had a light magic attack on something that he felt should be weak to light magic. Or even sometimes when something was weak, he's like, I don't think that would be weak, although he complained more when it was resistant to him or it wasn't weak. Or vice versa with darkness, because of the fact that his summon was darkness, was ignoring resistances. So if they were immune, and it wasn't something that obviously would be immune,
it's like, wait,
he wasted his turn and a lot of mana. Now, the ones that I created, I think that maybe he and I see eye to eye on what an elemental thing would be, because whenever he was like, Mark, why did you make this one not be weak to light? I'd be like, this one's from the book.
Yeah.
And when he was like, this thing matched what I expected, those were usually ones I had made. So if your players and you have a different aesthetic for what elements match, you may want to consider changing the ones up from the book. In my case, I decided to just be like, well, tough, those are the ones in the book. So you won't be able to just metagame it completely. Maybe bring someone who can determine resistances and weaknesses. There's a whole class that can get a free check to figure that out at the beginning of the combat. And if you can read your GM's mind and always know all of them,
it's kind of like getting that bonus.
It's kind of like getting that for free via meta. So I'm actually kind of okay with the fact that some of them are unpredictable in the bestiary. As the GM, I'm presenting this from my player anyway, because of the fact that it's worth noting, because everyone had a lot of fun, and there were a few things that I got player complaints about, and that was one of them.
You'll see also with the sample creatures that they have like a basic attack or two, and then like a couple of special attacks, but they're not like super complicated things to run.
There's literally only one creature that's not an elite or boss that is complicated. It's in the plants section. It also gives a good example of dealing with clocks. It's the Dragon Trap, which has a Dragon Eater ability where it swallows you. And that ability is like 4 times longer than any other ability, and it causes that creature to, I think, be like alone on its page, whereas most of the other pages have 2. So, you can see how things work. I highly recommend looking at the Dragon Trap if you have your Fabula Ultima for an example of that type of creature. So, yeah, that is the Fabula Ultima game. We had a lot of fun with it. So far, one of the players is in Africa now, so we're probably not going to play it for a little bit. But we got a really cool plot line that was continuing. We made it through a major arc. There were some player-based ideas of things that they wanted to do that were not even necessarily what I was expecting. You were not expecting us to be like,
let's bust this guy out of a secure prison using giant quantities of explosives that we stole from this previous place.
They stole a bunch of explosives, and then since the summoner's out of combat ability is to teleport somewhere that he's been before for huge amounts of MP, he wanted to teleport to the edge of the prison, which was also a dungeon, which was extra dimensional, and you can't teleport in or out of it. Then break into it using the explosives. Once in there, fight your way through, rescue the Prime Minister, who I just said had been captured and was not necessarily going to be in the story. Then, assuming that people were chasing after them through the area because the prison was actually like pretty far from the dungeon entrance, teleport back to the beginning of the dungeon and then walk out.
Yes.
So yeah, that actually worked. It was a close call because of the fact that the enemies left some powerful people right at the dungeon entrance just in case, and the group had to either push through using clocks or, as it turned out that they did, win a fight against the head of the Royal Guard, but they did manage to do that and escape with the imprisoned Prime Minister, who, as the sort of vizier slash chancellor slash minister type character, had taken the fall for bad stuff that was going on in the government and the king's murder or death, if it was not a murder, but everyone was pretty sure it was a murder.
Yep.
So,
the PCs are pretty sure he was innocent of that.
Yep. Well, that's why they released the Prime Minister. And so that just kind of happened. It was kind of a spur of the moment idea that the players wanted to do, and I made it work. And so we went through it, and wasn't hard to do using the rules from Fabula Ultima that are provided.
And one of the things we said we talk about a little bit more later that we haven't yet is sort of the how do you handle when you have different party sizes and what we were doing with that.
Right. So we wanted it to be kind of like a classic JRPG where you could get NPCs, but after a certain point, they would be like, well, you know, these 5 bad things are happening. There's all these villains. So we'll send some people off to do this, and you can choose who you want to bring with you. Up to a certain point, so that we would have 3 or 4 most of the time. We had 5 for a very brief time when the party brought 4 to rescue the Prime Minister, and they had the Prime Minister as a guest in the battle with them against the head of the Royal Guard.
And she was a tough opponent, though.
They kind of needed it. The head of the Royal Guard actually used the party's cheesy Guardian-based strategies against them while also having multiple actions, making the strategy even cheesier because usually, at least if your Guardian does cheesy Guardian strategies, they're not doing anything except for the cheesy Guardian strategies. But when it came to the captain of the Royal Guard, she was doing her cheesy Guardian strategy and multiple other turns, and was a huge pain. Fortunately, summoning ignores resistances, which is good against Guardians, so that was one good news for the party. So yeah, that's Fabula Ultima in a nutshell, in a quick hour-and-a-half explanation. Hope you enjoyed this. We looked at the ins and outs, talked a little bit about not only the philosophy, but how the math works in some cases, and even give a little bit of advice of how to approach it for your first game. So, when this is somewhere that has comments, you can let us know in the comments what you think about Fabula Ultima, or if you've played Fabula Ultima. And until then, take care, and we'll see you later, YouTube.
Bye,
Bye YouTube.